Hey y'all, welcome back. We've made it to Unit 3, the topic of which is Proto-feminist Beliefs about Gender. So far in the course, we've laid some groundwork on basics of social movement theory, collective identity, and feminist ideas. In this unit, we're going to take a step back in time so that we can lay a different kind of groundwork before we move forward. Specifically, students in women's and gender studies courses often ask me why societies contain gender imbalances in the first place and where those imbalances originated. Unfortunately, I don't have a single concrete answer to this question, but I do think that it's valuable for us to look historically at the issue and to interrogate as best we can the origins of the power dynamics that we see at play in modern Western society. So this unit is all about tracing gender inequity back in time to look at the roots of the ideas that shape our modern conceptions of gender. Essentially, I want us to take a moment to look at where the problem, quote, started, so that we can continue to think about how people are trying to challenge it. So in this lecture, I'm going to go specifically into a little bit in depth into some really important philosophical ideas in Western political ideology. And from Estelle Friedman's chapter on gender and power, you'll get all kinds of information, both within the US, in the Western philosophical tradition, and also more globally and internationally. She does a really lovely job of that. So, when discussing gender and power in Western society specifically, it's important for us to acknowledge that we're not talking about universal truths or universal narratives, and I think Estelle Friedman does a good job of highlighting that multiple times in the chapter. What we're discussing here is ideas that arose within a specific historical moment and a specific context. So, for our purposes, in an attempt to understand the gendered power structure of the United States, we need to also understand philosophies of power and personhood that arose in 17th and 18th century England, which were then transferred to the political power structure of the British American colony, which in the late 18th century became the United States. So for a bit of context on this philosophical and ideological moment, I turn to Christine Stansell's text, The Feminist Promise. This is a great text if you're looking for more in-depth information about the histories of feminisms. Stansell opens her book by attempting to do exactly the thought experiment that we're doing here, which is to think about how gender and power have been conceptualized over time. The quote here comes from her introduction to gendered ideas in the 17th century. She says, quote, "There's nothing new about men's power or women's recognition of it. Men have dominated, ruled, lorded over, and subjugated women as long as there has been recorded history. But the ways people have understood the preeminence of one sex over the other changed through time. Western beliefs are rooted in a Christian schema that divided human beings into ranks according to a divine plan. As God ruled the world and man ruled beasts, so monarchs, usually kings, ruled subjects. Fathers ruled children, masters ruled apprentices and servants, and men governed women. Rebelling against one's place in this order amounted to defying the will of God." Whoa. This idea of the ruling power structure as being preordained by the Christian God served not only to keep women in their place, subservient to men, but also to keep all people in their places, subservient to their lords or their kings, down here. In 17th and 18th century political thought, the divine right of kings began to be challenged, and the radical idea that perhaps people could be trusted to rule themselves based on consent and choice led to not just one, but three major global political revolutions: the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution, all within about 30 years of each other. In each case, the demands and ideologies were similar. The intrinsic value and rights of man could only be fully realized if men were allowed to rule themselves. Now, you'll notice that I said man, and I do literally mean man, because while the rhetoric and ideology of these movements was based fully in ideas of freedom, independence, and liberty, who had access to that independence and liberty and who was trusted to be rational enough to handle it was quite limited. In the case of the United States, only white, property-owning adult men were considered to be rational and reasonable enough to handle the demands of political citizenship. Women were considered too emotional and too fragile to participate in the, quote, dirty world of public life and specifically of politics, while people of color were considered too unintelligent. American women were, however, given an ideological role to play through their labor as mothers. Ideas about the importance of motherhood to society assured Americans that women too could add to the country by exercising reason in their care and training of their sons, and in the assistance they provided to their husbands. In this way, women were told that they could help shape the American Republic through a silent partnership with active male citizens. This idea of the silent woman behind the men was known as virtual representation. And the idea was that women didn't need to be granted their own rights or their own suffrage because their interests would be represented by the men in their lives. This idea was written into English common law under what was known as coverture. According to his commentaries on the law of coverture, Sir Blackstone wrote in 1771 that by marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything, and her condition during her marriage is called coverture. In effect, under this law, the personhood of a woman is covered by that of her husband's. Under the rules of coverture, women were prohibited from owning property, from keeping any wages earned from their labor, from inheriting wealth, from signing contracts, from writing wills, from suing in court, including suing for divorce, from refusing sexual relations with their husbands, which, by the way, they did not have the right to do, and from maintaining legal custody over their own children. Under the law of coverture, in fact, women were not even fully considered people. The law of coverture was not fully transferred from English to American law when the U.S. was established, but many of its assumptions and beliefs about women did become part of the American construction of womanhood. And some, such as women's inability to own property or to have legal custody of their children, were codified also into U.S. law. One of the sort of remnants of this idea of coverture that we still see in our modern conception of gender and gendered expectations is the expectation that at marriage, a woman takes the name of her husband as a symbol that she has become part of his person. Women of the 18th century did not necessarily accept this shortchanging of rights and personhood lightly. Particularly in France, women who were working alongside men during the French Revolution were also releasing their own philosophical texts, calling for women's rights to be considered alongside the new rhetoric of the, quote, universal rights of man. It is within this historic moment that Mary Wollstonecraft wrote her Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1792, which we're reading an excerpt from. This text called for these new beliefs about rationality and liberty and the rights of men to govern themselves to be extended to women, to allow women to be considered full citizens legally, independent of their husbands, to dissolve coverture and virtual representation, and to allow women to own their own property and to access education. Her ideas were viewed at the time as wildly radical, but through the lens of history have often been marked as the very beginning of the modern push for women's rights. Okay, so there is so much more that I could say about the ways that Enlightenment thought and the shaping of the American Republic have continued to affect our beliefs about gender. But I don't want this video to get too ridiculously long, so I'll let you get way more of that information from Estelle Friedman's chapter on gender and power, which, by the way, is amazing. And I will see y'all on the discussion boards. Bye.